Good afternoon and welcome to episode 6 of the ACC History Project. I'm Mayo Lee, your co-host. Once upon a time in 1974, I was hired by Chuy Ito, board president of the Asian Community Center, then called the Japanese Community Center, to become his first paid coordinator.
And I'm Jeff Ogata, the other co-host. I was one of the students that restarted Asian Legal Services Outreach in 1976, known as ALSO. ALSO originally started in 1973. We were a community of law students that provided education, legal services, and advocacy to and for the Sacramento Asian community. While we were not part of ACC, we used their office space in the Tambara House and shared in what was going on in the community at that time.
Then you're just like me, Jeff. We've been around for a long time. Jeff, we're the OGs. For those not familiar with the term original gangsters, but I think the more appropriate name is old generation. Okay, so why is today's program called From One Became Many?
Today's program is about organizations in Sacramento that were formed in the 1970s and 80s by Asian Community Services, or ACS, were assisted by ACC, or were started by people who just hung around ACC like at the Tambara House. We'll talk about Health for All, Tanoshimi Kai, Asian Job Resources Project, Asian Resources, Asian Health Clinic, Asian Legal Services Outreach, Asian Pacific State Employees Association, or APSIA, and Stepping Stones, which is now Asian Pacific Community Counseling.
We're going to show video clips from our interviews with Lily Yi Shiroy, Dean Lan, Derek Lam, Clement Kong, William Yi, and Paul Igasaki.
And we're going to talk to 3 guests who were here from the beginning. They are Hachi Asamura, Raymond Lee, and Harriet Taniguchi. They were all involved in social work and activism in the early days. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
All right, and as a bonus, at the end of the program, we'll mention couples who got together and because of ACC. That part of the program is called From Two Became One.
You'll definitely have to stay until the end for that. So, in a previous episode of the ACC History Project, we covered an organization called Asian Community Services, or ACS, the precursor organization to ACC. ACS was formed in 1969 by activists, students, and faculty from UC Davis, Sacramento State University, and Sacramento City College. Among them were June Oto, Earl Shiroy, Peggy Saika, Randy Shiroy, Harold Fong, Raymond Lee, and Lily Yi. Earl was a social worker and community organizer. At the time, he was working for Sacramento County as the liaison for the Asian community living in Southside Park. Then he became faculty in Sac State's Department of Social Work. Earl worked behind the scenes, setting much of the tone and direction for ACS. We will hear a lot more about him later in this program.
Another influential person was Professor Isao Fujimoto. He joined UC Davis in 1967, headed up the Community Development Program, and he and George Kagiwara started the Asian American Studies. Now, he got many students involved in field work, which led them to pursue careers in community development.
Another one of Isao's students was Lily Yi. She signed up for his class, which involved the Community Service Project. She was placed at William Land School, which had more than 50% Chinese students. Many of them struggled with or did not speak English. In the spring of 1970, Parkview Church approved the use of their house on the corner of 8th and T Streets for tutoring and recreation programs. Dubbed the Yellow House, students from William Land School went there after school and during the summer. From there, the number of programs and volunteers from UC Davis and Sac State grew. Let's hear some of Lily Yi Shiroy's reflections as she talks to Hachi Asamura in front of the Yellow House.
Good morning. We are here on the grounds of Parkview Presbyterian Church, and I'm here with Lily Yi Shiroy, who was one of the first participants, the original participants of ACS.
Well, what I remember is that I first got involved because I was a student at UC Davis, and the Asian American Studies was offering a class, a community service project class, where we could come in and we were assigned to work with the William Land School students who might need help with English. At the time, the school was like over 50% Chinese, and there were no Chinese-speaking staff, and the only Chinese person was the school secretary. So I signed up for the class, my roommate signed up for the class, and so there were only 2 of us who came into Sacramento.
Wow.
And we went to William Land School. We met 2 young students. I still remember their name. It was Pak Lim and Sam Tam, and we started with them in the school cafeteria. But not long after that, it was the spring of 1970, Parkview approved our use of this building for our tutorial.
Oh, great.
So we walked the couple students over to this house, and it was yellow. And so they said, oh, it's the Yellow House. And before long, it was their brothers and sisters and friends who were coming to the Yellow House, and the name stuck.
Ah, terrific. Now, who was the instructor of Asian American Studies at the time at UC Davis?
I'm pretty sure at the time it was Isao Fujimoto.
Oh, Professor Fujimoto, okay. Yeah, he was very much involved with the community.
Mm-hmm.
In his later years, he was involved with the farming community.
Mm-hmm.
So what type of activity did you have here at the Yellow House?
At the time we started that initial quarter, it was basically assisting them with homework assignment. It was an after-school homework support kind of project. But in the summer that year, we had a lot of volunteers that came from the Sac State University, and one of the students, his name was Gary Matsumoto, took a lead role in organizing the first Yellow House recreation program that summer. And so we had quite a few students come, quite a few volunteer students come to help on the program, and a lot of kids in the neighborhood came here. So after that summer, it was well established. Yellow House was the place to come for those kids.
It's amazing that we're standing in front of the Yellow House 50 years later, located on the grounds of Parkview Presbyterian Church.
June Oto was another one of Professor Fujimoto's students at UC Davis. Her major was community development. We'll cover her later in the program when we talk about Health for All, which she set up in 1980. In 1972, the Japanese Community Center, or JCC, was started by a different, much older group of people. It later changed its name to Asian Community Center, or ACC. As fate would have it, people from the activist ACS organization became involved in JCC. ACS's programs for non-English speaking immigrants complemented JCC's focus on addressing the housing and health needs of the same group.
In 1973, ACS ended operations and turned its services over to JCC, along with the people running them. A snapshot of JCC at the time would show a diverse group of social workers, activists, students, lawyers, church members and business people, and civil servants working towards a common cause. This included people in the Japanese and Chinese communities. The inclusive culture and the mission that developed during this time became a big part of ACC's playbook for the next 50 years.
So let's go back to 1971, which provides a good example of how the tree planted by ACS branched off to start something new and independent. Raymond Lee and Harold Fong, 2 founding members of ACS, decided to go on their own and start the People's Bookstore to promote socialism and how they felt was a better way to take care of people's needs. Their belief was so strong, they started a health clinic right in their store, which eventually became the Asian Health Clinic. Today, it still exists as the Paul Hom Asian Clinic. It's staffed by students from UC Davis, and the medical director is Dr. Ron Jan. Raymond is here to talk about why he started the bookstore and the health clinic. Welcome, Raymond.
Thank you, Jeff. The Paul Hom Clinic was originally started by Dr. Kumagai of the UCD Medical Center and Asian and People's Bookstore East Wind Collective. Dr. Kumagai provided the interns, and we provided the location, the staff, some of the ancillary services, and publicity for the opening of the clinic. Many organizations during that period outside of Sacramento did the same thing. They ran many programs. Some of these programs were run by IWK, Iwer Kun, Red Guard Party, Everybody's Bookstore, and all were premised after the Black Panther program and the Serve the People programs of the Black Panthers. In the same vein, People's Bookstore operated a cooperative childcare for county workers, had a free after-school program, film series every weekend, and ran a non-governmental free health clinic. Ran a non-governmental funded youth program. None of our programs were funded by the government. We gained the funds from running People's Bookstore and help from the community. People who we served helped fund the program. Some of the larger supporters came from Walter Fong of Farmers Market, who supplied our program with milk for all our various programs involving children. Frank Fatt of restaurant fame, and Alan Jang, who provided immeasurable and generous support for our programs. Like ACC, we had many students that supported the bookstore. One additional note, People's Bookstore in East Wind was a breakaway organization. We felt the democratic process was not being followed and that a small number of people actually ran the program. Now, finally, back to the clinic. There were other clinics to come that followed, but Lindy Kumagai and People's Bookstore were at the creation and the first to start an ongoing, consistent health program. Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond. The People's Bookstore Asian Health Clinic, and later renamed the Paul Hom Asian Clinic, were not a product of ACC, but we included it in this story because people like you, Raymond, and Harold were once part of ACS. They were full of idealism, creativity, and energy. They, like many others of the day, were socialpreneurs with a community activist agenda. A lot of them took their cues from community organizer Earl Sheroy or studied under Professor Fujimoto at UC Davis, and their professional lives would intersect with ACC in the future. As you'll see a little later, Raymond comes back into the ACC picture when we discuss how Asian Resources, Inc. came about.
Just as the Yellow House in the early 1970s was a hotbed of activity for educational and recreational programs, and a place for like-minded people to meet, the Tambara House at 2200 6th Street became that place for JCC when it moved there in 1975. Unfortunately, it burned down in 1986, but for a decade, it's where ACC incubated new programs and organizations and where ACC assisted other community groups.
So here to talk about the goings-on at the Tambara House are Harriet Taniguchi and Haj Yasumura. Harriet, you were then the social work intern turned coordinator at the ACS JCC location and part of the move to the Tambara House. I know even June Odo rented a room upstairs at the Tambara House. So what are your recollections about the Tambara House?
Thanks, May. I was recruited by Earl Sheroy to do the 2 years of social work field placement as coordinator for Japanese Community Center of Sacramento Valley, which later became Asian Community Center. We originally were at Mr. Kanji Nishijima's house and then transitioned to the Tambara House. We had to go through a variance procedure to set up the community center because Tambara House was in a residential area. Brought it up to change the electrical standards, converted the garage to a classroom, and then wrote a grant to get a city funding to sponsor various classes for the API community. Margaret Fujita taught the ceramics class, and then there was a koto class, a Go Club, various gatherings for individuals. In addition to these activities, there are groups who met to address various needs in the API community. Through the influence of Earl, his quiet leadership, his recruitment of masters in social work students, the Tambara House became a community hub of social activism. So we had various groups meeting and organizing.
Well, now I'm going to ask Hodge. You were the Asian liaison for the County Department of Social Services and involved in many ways. You also served for a time on the ACC board.
Yes, I recall when I was became an Asian liaison worker for the Sacramento County Welfare Department. Earl Shroy went on to be a faculty member at Sacramento State University in School of Social Work. During the day at the Tambara House was busy with elderly programs, the ceramic program as Harriet has mentioned, and also we had students with the fall of Saigon. We had students from UC Davis and also students from Sacramento State University dropped by and asked if they could use the Tambara House as a meeting place so that they could find ways to work with each other to contact their families who were stranded in South Vietnam. Also, during the evening, Tambara House was busy with meetings. I had attended some of those meetings with my little children at the time, because at the time my wife was working in the evenings. And I soon left the Asian liaison position to pursue a higher salary for the master's degree in social work. So I went to child welfare. And through ACC, they were asked to have 2 part-time Asian liaison. Lorraine Mizuno was bilingual in Japanese, and she was one of the person that was selected, and also LSG, who was bilingual in Chinese. So they took my place and had meetings at the ACC organization at the Tambara House. I eventually came back working as an Asian liaison worker with my salary coming with me. So from then on, I had concentrated at the direction of our director, Mr. Redmond at the time, to concentrate my work with the Southeast Asian refugees. So a lot of my work had covered with a lot of meetings, evening meetings with the Vietnamese community, the Hmong community, the Mien community, and so on. So the Tambara House was very active both day and evening.
So, as Hodges pointed out, there were so many people coming, going out of the Tambara House, it was hard to keep track of them at times. College students would show up after school, working people after work. There are 2 organizations, not started by ACC, but that have a close connection to ACC. One is Asian Legal Services Outreach, or ALSO, which started in 1973, and the other is the Asian Pacific State Employees Association, or APSIA, started in 1975. Last week, I interviewed Dean Land, who was a frequent Tambara House visitor and one of the founding members of APSIA. More than 45 years later, he still remembers the sights and sounds, the people, and the life-changing lessons from that era. Let's hear from Dean.
I came to Sacramento in 1975.
And what brought you here?
Well, I was going to grad school at Davis, and so moved to Sacramento, continuing grad school. Moved down to the Southside Park area, even.
So is that when you became familiar with the Tambara House?
Yeah, I was living in an apartment at 13th and T, and so I in the hood, if you will. So there was this nice warm drop-in center, and Mei Lee was saying that the Tambara House, it's literally a magnet. It's a huge drop-in center, and hey, it's good for, it was a good place for us social activists to go to and to help. And so since I was interested in serving and working with the underserved, if you will, in the Sacramento region, it was a fantastic place. I remembered dropping by and seeing Mei Lee and people like Andy Noguchi was there, and Hach Yashimura, Raymond Lee was there, and Randy Shirai. So it was just a good place to drop by. You know, the dedication of those folks, it really, really did inspire me. And so I understand that the value that the ACC value currently is in terms of talking about respect, talking about diversity, talking about inclusion. And so I think those issues have remained with me and have resonated with me. And on those issues, I remember that ACC and here in Sacramento, the activists, the organizations were sure unified, coming from the Bay Area and being somewhat active. Well, as a student, I mean, there's only so much you can be active with, but you know, I was involved in a couple organizations down in the Bay Area, and just within the Chinese organizations in San Francisco, you can see that, oh my goodness, there's a lot of friction, shall we say, among the Chinese organizations. Here in Sacramento, oh my goodness, the Chinese got along with all the groups, and then hey, not only does the Chinese get along, but later on, you know, we got along with the other ethnic groups too. So it was just so different not having one group, one Chinese group fight another Chinese group.
Thank you, Dean. In the next set of clips, we're going to see what Clement Kong, Paul Igasaki, and William Yee have to say about the early days of Asian Legal Services outreach. They're going to talk a little bit about the start of ALSO, why they got involved, what kinds of work they did, and also Paul is going to talk about his conversation with Earl Shiroi, and a little bit about what they got from ALSO in terms of how to help their future careers.
Did you start out by going to ACS as well?
Yes, what I remember was that it also was started by a bunch of law students from McGeorge and UC Davis. I remember people like Wilford Lim. I think Wilford had connections with Asian Law Caucus, a Bay Area civil rights organization, was started by a great lawyer and a good friend of mine, Dale Minami. And I think that that Wilford wanted to sort of mimic the same thing. So he got together with, I remember people like Brent Kato, Joe Nose, Cal Abe, of course, Andy Noguchi was there. I still remember living with Andy above the second floor in the V Street Victorian, where also was housed. I believe probably Asian Community Services also housed there. And like Will, I kind of went to school at Berkeley during the turbulent 1960s. That was a period of great activism. It was the end of the free speech movement. It was the Vietnam War, Cambodian War. And like a lot of other students, we were trying to find some sort of meaning or purpose in life. And I thought the right path would be to go to law school. And when I started law school, I felt it was a great way to use my legal education to help this underserved Asian community, where there were a lot of elderly and bilingual clients who didn't know how to maneuver government or the laws because of language barriers, educational barriers, and financial barriers. And that was the reason why I wanted to join and work at also.
During the late 60s, early 70s, there was a time when it's the beginning and coming together of the Asian community. During that time, there's a lot of talk about there are issues out there where the Asian community lacks a certain amount of respect or has a lack of power in the Sacramento area to do anything. At the time, I think I was influenced when I was going to Sac State. People like Earl Sheroy, June Odo, and so forth helped identify there was a need in the Asian community. And my particular interest, I was going to plan to go to law school. So I heard about this Asian Legal Services outreach and decided to go over there and meet some people and basically just got involved.
Well, obviously, when you guys started out, you weren't lawyers yet. So what kinds of things were you doing at the time?
Well, we did a lot of work in the social service. We filled out EDD forms for clients. We did Social Security forms. We did immigration petitions, and believe it or not, Andy and I, we were doing taxes for people. And thank God nobody audited those taxes. Our clients will probably be doing 5 to 10 alarm park. You know, that Trump's facing now.
So, Paul, let me ask you. I know when we were recruited to sort of restart also when we came in the fall of 1976, we had conversations with Earl Sheroy and Peggy Sakai. Can you kind of describe one of your conversations with Earl about what he thought ALSO's purpose was?
I didn't talk so much with Earl in the very beginning. It's mostly Peggy and other staff in ACC at that point. But when we first got started, our big thing was trying to recruit the law students who would work on it, have schedules for them to come in and do basically legal advice clinic kind of thing. And we got to know the operational staff there. I think I talked to Earl later when they had thoughts about what should be happening to also and how things were going. We found that there were resources we lacked. And so I think we worked on, one of the things I really devoted some time to is learning how to do fundraising or foundation proposals. And we didn't get much money, but we got some. But I think the discussions I had, or I remember with Earl, was after we got our first, well, actually we got the LISCRIC grant first, the Law Student Civil Rights Research Council. And that was a grant to have 3 students working through the summer. And that was Sandra Chan, Derek Letta, and myself. That's when Earl was saying, well, you guys got funding, bye, time for you to leave. And it was the theory they had was that they were organizing communities, and once they got something going, then we should go off on our own. Of course, we were law students, we didn't have staff, we didn't have money for rent, so it was kind of, we thought it was going to be our closing days. But I do remember those discussions, and Earl being very clear about the theory that they were working on about spinning off various projects, which clearly they've done. In the end, also didn't survive, but it lasted for a number of years.
Yeah.
Well, I think the formation of ALSO at the time, the coming together of the Asian community, really helped develop a stronger community where we were basically building trust. A lot of these people would not go to any place for advice or anything for fear. And I think I'll take credit for also that the people that got involved got involved in the community later. I mean, later on when ACC was formed, some of the directors and board members and committee members came from the group of attorneys that came from ALSO and so forth. So it was a wonderful time to experiment amongst ourselves, even though we didn't know what we were doing, go out there and cause some good trouble maybe, but it paid off, and I think we're still reaping the rewards today.
Will, you were on the board of ACC, weren't you?
Yeah, I think Clement was also, if I'm not mistaken. And so, these are the kinds of things where I say we're still involved with the community, not necessarily in the legal community, but just in the Asian community as a whole. So I think that's been very beneficial that way.
Okay, we have a technical problem. Go ahead, Jeff. So Asian Legal Services Outreach survived for about... We're going to just resolve this technical problem. Someone is screen sharing when they shouldn't be. Okay. So say we're going to take care of a technical problem. Oh, we're having a technical problem right now, so we're going to... Someone is screen sharing when they shouldn't be. So whoever is doing that... Great, thank you very much. So as I was saying, also survived for about 20 years, one of the organizations that did not make it through, but based upon the energy and financial commitment from people like Steve Koyosako and Goldie Yang, also continued on, as Paul pointed out, some of the fundraising that we were doing, the grant writing we were doing. Back in those days, there was very little money for legal services, and so we made do with what we had, but also want to point out that people like Randy Shiroi, Minette Kwok, Jerry Okimoto, Milt Yi, and our paralegal Frank Leong, who spoke 4 languages, they worked really, really hard in trying to provide legal services to the community. So it was a good time. We had a lot of fun. And over the years, many people from ALSO and from APSIA have served on the board of ACC, as Will pointed out, including himself, Clement Kong, Paul Higashi, and Jean Chong, which again says a lot about the community that ACC developed at the Tambara House. I can definitely say that they were bound by common interests and deep friendships.
Well, Tanashimikai, 1976. Back at the Tambara House, ACC spent a lot of time identifying community needs such as health, mental health, and other services for seniors. This led to the founding of Tanashimikai to address the nutritional and socialization needs of the elderly Japanese, and it was led by Kenji Morishige.
ACC set up Tanashimikai at 2 sites, one on Fridays at the Sacramento Buddhist Church and the other on Wednesdays at the Sacramento Japanese United Methodist Church. Mrs. Tanihara was hired to take reservations, and Betty Kashiwagi, who spoke Japanese, was the nutrition site manager and paid through a small grant from the Area 4 on Aging. A similar setup was developed for the elderly Chinese nutrition program with Edna Liang as the nutrition site manager at the New Helvetia Housing Project at 8th and Broadway.
So I want to talk about another organization that ACC planted the seed for was Asian Pacific Community Counseling. It started originally as Stepping Stones in 1986 with Kathy Omachi as its first director. Harriet, you were serving on ACC board at the time while this was being planned. Tell us about how and why this came about.
Yes, May. One of the main issues that was identified by the various groups meeting at the Tambara House was the lack of culturally relevant and bilingual mental health services for the API communities. Paul and Marion Ono, in particular, Marion was a counselor at Sac City College. Reverend Takarabi of the Parkview Presbyterian Church, Dr. Luke Kim, who was the only bilingual psychiatrist in town at that point, Raymond Lee, Reverend Nin, Jane Tamano, Joan Hiroshi, and other individuals and myself organized to address this need. Through public policy and advocacy and testimony, and I'm sure Raymond will remember this, Raymond and Earl were in the audience when we testified before the Mental Health Advisory Board. We were successful in addressing to them the needs of the API community and had the mental health plan stopped at that point. We then met with the mental health department, and the mental health department said, okay, we will allocate some funding for the API as well as other communities of color. And it was a stepping stones became about because we applied for funding. But prior to that, we had to go through a transition process with the organization because our goal initially was for the department to provide bilingual bicultural services, with all of their clinics. But instead, they offered a grant to us, which we then decided to apply. So we did incorporate for counseling services. At that point, Reverend Nin requested a separate program for the Southeast Asian community. So again, we mutually agreed to share resources, hence the Southeast Asian Assistance Center was formed. Later, through the Mental Health Services Act, state funds became available through the county for clinical services, and we applied for that and received a grant to provide clinical services, and it was named the Transcultural Wellness Center, which is part of Asian Pacific Community Counseling. And it was really critical because we did provide bilingual bicultural services for at least 7 various Asian Pacific Islander communities. So again, this was an unmet or unserved population.
Thanks, Harriet. Next, we're going to look at the origin of Asian Resources, Inc., or ARI, which has its roots at ACC. My co-host, Mei Lee, was the director of ARI for 26 years. Before her, the organization had another name, Asian Job Resources Project, set up by Raymond Lee, who was its first director in 1981. But the origin of ARI goes back even further to 1979, when ACC ran the Summer Youth Employment and Training Program. May, talk about the Summer Youth Program.
All right. Well, the need for a summer youth training generated when we were housing a Vietnamese student association upstairs at the Tambara House. After the fall of Saigon, these college students and younger siblings were cut off from families and financial support. An opportunity arose to apply for employment funds based on their needs. After the summer training was over, ACC continued by developing the Asian Manpower Program. And Kathy Omachi, there's that name again, she was its first director. Kathy vividly recalls going before a funding hearing. Supervisor Isla Collin asked about ACC separating this program off. Kathy turned to Earl Sheroy and Raymond Lee, who were in the audience, and got a signal from them. Kathy stated, "We all have to grow up, and it's not like we won't continue to have community support from ACC." And now, Raymond, tell us about your part with the Asian Resources, Job Resources Project.
Okay, thank you, May. Employment services in Sacramento began with Asian Manpower Training Program. The ACC program, which it was important because it was the first program to target the Asian community in its services. The program ran for 1 year and was abruptly ended. I don't know for what reason. But a newly organized organization, Asian Job Resources Project, applied and won funding for the program. I became director, but due to personal reasons, a staff member became interim director. And later, the program ended with Mei Lee as permanent director. Her organization today, Asian Resources, still serves the community, and it's a very good program. Thank you.
Well, Raymond, please include about your advice that Earl gave you in consideration of spinning off from ACC. I think you would talk to us.
Well, Earl says if you want to do this, go ahead, but you're not going to get ACS as a support. We're not going to put the name onto it. But what you need to do is you need to go out and organize. You got to go out there and do it for yourself or do it for your organization. This whole thing about we supporting you, we springing you forward is one thing. So I had to do the same thing you did with other programs, May, and that was to go ahead and get letters of support, get community support, and then we went forward with the program, Asian Job Resources Project. So that's how we started.
Oh, great. Well, to continue on that same vein, about my role, I was fresh from social work school, and I got the chance to apply for the director position that due to unfortunate circumstances, Raymond, you had to leave. But building upon what Raymond established, and after finishing my internship at Health for All, which we'll talk about next, this was a natural segue. Asian Resources, Inc., or ARI, it was like a whole new restart. I had to write the proposal to seek refunding, hire 2 new staff since only the office manager stayed on with me, expand the site location, create a whole new board made up of community and business members. In fact, one of those board members, Peggy Lim, had also served on the ACC board. And with the name change via the bylaws, ARI under me ran for the next 26 years and was renowned for its ESL and citizenship classes, community services, and employment training for our immigrants, refugees, youth, and families from all ethnicities. And passing it on forward now is being led by Stephanie Nguyen as the executive director. Now, if many of the organizations that started by ACC are the children of it, then my sister's house, started by ARI, could be the grandchild of ACC. And what it was that there was a need for cultural and language shelter for women caught up in the domestic violence in the API community. And was spearheaded by ARI staff person Carol Ching. Now, Hot Yatsumura, Jean Chong, and Elaine Chow were some of the initial folks on the planning, and finally, under 5 years of incubation at ARI, my sister's house was launched. It was the same playbook that we follow, using ACC's intentional strategy of spinning programs off to be independent.
Health for All, known as HFA, was another nonprofit venture incubated at ACC. In 1980, ACC was studying different housing and health programs in the run-up to eventually building the nursing home. June Oto, one of the original members of ACS, was now at ACC as an outreach worker. June had a book written by Jack Anderson of the National Economic Development and Law Center. In it, he explained step by step how community organizations could start a health clinic. Long story short, this idea took hold at ACC and was spun off as Health for All, with June as its executive director. And May, apparently you didn't have enough to do, so you were involved in this too.
Yes, I was the social work intern and worked with June and the many volunteer community mothers from the Southside neighborhood to outreach and gain support for a preventative health clinic. ACC provided startup funds from its membership dues, and $1,000 came from the Sacramento Presbyterian Mission Action Committee. Health for All would eventually rely on Medi-Cal reimbursement funds. There were tons of people from health and nursing professionals, Chinese and Vietnamese interpreters, ACC board members were involved donating time, equipment, resources to launch Health for All. We turned to Phil Hiroshima, who incorporated Health for All, and he even donated an antique wooden exam table. Later on, Dr. Richard Ikeda, who was the medical director, then succeeded June Oto. Now, those first 10 years, Health for All, with a staff that spoke at least 7 languages, served many of the Southeast Asian refugees coming into Sacramento County. Hua Tong and Lin Ban, trained by HFA, became the first trilingual Chinese, Vietnamese, and English healthcare workers in Sacramento. HFA established the first school-based clinic in Sacramento, an Alzheimer's daycare and resource center, and 4 adult day healthcare programs, including the one off of Florin Road near 24th Street. Eventually, Health for All operated 7 clinics, many housed on-site at neighborhood schools to ensure preventive health care and immunizations were available to low-income communities.
And in 1986, a young UC Davis student named Derek Lamb applied to Health for All to do an internship. Yes, that Derek Lamb, who is now ACC's Chief Executive Officer and President. We talked to Derek about his experience back then. Here he is to tell us what happened.
Let's go back to the beginning. 36 years ago, in 1986, you were an intern with Health for All, working for June Otto. How did that come about? Why did you do that?
Well, I was a student at UC Davis. As part of the curriculum, we all had to choose a field practicum. So at the office, we were given a thick, docket of different choices. And so I browsed through all the different nonprofit organizations, and Health for All really, came to my attention because it provided healthcare for Sacramentans, and at which time I was thinking to go into management after graduating from Davis. And so I looked at opportunities to learn more about the healthcare sector and what I can do when I graduated.
So you were already interested in healthcare at that time?
Yes, I am interested in healthcare. And so when I interviewed with June as a prospective field instructor, I was really impressed by her story because she told me that Health for All was founded by 8 minority women. And so with the intent to really serve the low-income minority older adults. And also they have a primary care clinic at that time and adult day healthcare. So I was really intrigued by the story, how it was founded. And so without any kind of further searches, I decided to take up this opportunity to be her intern.
So I guess that was a good experience for you because it seemed to have put you on your current career path.
Well, at which point, it's interesting because as I mentioned, I was leaning more towards management. And so after I started with June, and so she got to know more about my background, my aspiration, and being a social worker by training. So June asked me this question. So Derek, I think I see a social worker in you. So have you ever thought about pursuing a master in social work instead of a master in business administration? And I told her, hey, I never thought about that. That's kind of interesting, but I have to see if this is really what I want to do. And 2 things that she mentioned to me, which really, brought to light why I end up being a social worker. Number one was, hey, Derek, you are a man, and man actually is almost like an extinct species in the social work in the field. And second, you're bilingual and bicultural. You know how to speak Chinese, and I do think, meaning June was saying, I do think that you will have a lot of opportunities to help people. So that kind of turned my...
Well, May, I'm not one to talk, but Derek seemed to have a lot more hair back in the day than he does now.
Yes, that's a really interesting story and a very interesting picture of Derek. And I didn't recognize him when he showed me. He says, May, do you remember me? Do you remember me? I said, I know how you look now. And then he showed me that picture. I just cracked up. And Derek's career has really come full circle back to ACC. Now, people may be wondering why ACC was spinning off these programs instead of running them itself. This was because of the vision of Asian Community Services. Its stated purpose was twofold, and I quote, to raise issues that affected or were affected and were of concern to the Sacramento Asian community, and to initiate community development programs in which the people being served by these programs would eventually take over and run these programs independently.
Earl was a mentor to, to many people. After his stint at the county, Earl became faculty in Sac State School of Social Work, where Harold Fong, Hotch, Lily Yee, June Oto, and Harriet pursued their master's degrees. June recently sent us a list of things she learned from Earl over the years working with him. Here are just a few items from that list. How do you choose which issues to take on? Choose issues that unite people, build momentum, and are winnable. Money is not always good. It's better to decline money if it will deflect from your mission and purpose or alienate you from the community. Don't be afraid of conflict. It can be useful. A certain amount of conflict is an essential element in group formation. And an organizer should be a silent leader. If you speak for the people, they will never learn to speak for themselves.
Well, everyone, we're coming to the end of today's program. There's just one more thing we want to share, and that's how ACS, JCC, ACC, and the Tambara House brought couples together in matrimony. Yep, we were young and we were hooking up. I don't think they'll mind if I give them a shout out in this segment called From Two Became One. Randy and Lily Yee Shiroy, Art Chen and Peggy Saika, Tim Shiranaka and Wanda Chang. And Wanda was at that time an ACC board member, and she served as the ESL teacher at the Tambara House. Cal Hara and Donna Alfolk. Paul and Luann Igasaki, who met through Deanna Jang. Raymond Lee and Janice Tanaka, one of the original board members of ACS. And last but not least, yours truly, moi, and my late husband, Brother Milt Yee. Actually, we met when I was a HFA social work intern, and Milt's field placement was at also, and the office sites were just around the corner from each other. Now, this shows you what a wonderful 50 years has been. Before we say goodbye, I want to thank my co-host, Jeff Ogata. He is like the many people we talked about today, always helping to build organizations around him. He's never held an official position at ACC, yet he answered my call to help ACC rediscover its history. Jeff, tell us how you felt about this project and then help close us out.
Thanks, May. The theme of this episode is From One Became Many. I learned many interesting things about the origins of several of our community organizations and had some of my memories revived. The question is, who or what is the one? Sounds like the Matrix. I think we agree that although ACS was the first organization, neither it nor ACC is the one. I think we can say, as evidenced by many of the people we have talked to, that the one is our shared vision of providing much of the, sorry about that, our shared vision of providing much needed services to our community and providing education and advocacy so the Asian American and Pacific Islander community can exercise that power that comes from one shared vision. Many of us came to Sacramento from other places where each distinct group had its own organizations and factional disputes. We knew Sacramento was different because even though there are separate groups, all of us have tried to work together to advance our vision in unity. As proof, we can point to ACS's history of having the Japanese and Chinese working and playing side by side. The Japanese Community Center became the Asian Community Center because that was important to the board. So for me, the one has led to the creation of many organizations, albeit some more successful than others, that are addressing the critical needs of our community and society. And that's the legacy of people like Earl Shiroy, Leo Goto, Chui Ito, and the hundreds of other folks that ACC has been documenting through this history project. And there's more to come. Thank you for watching today's program.
Thank you. And I want to thank Ted Fong and his crew for all the help. And Gloria, Jean Shiamoto, and of course, the guests here. There's Raymond, Lee, Harriet Taniguchi, Hach Yasumura, and ourselves as co-hosts.